Good evening. I'm Louis Goodman, Professor and Dean Emeritus of the School of International Service. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation between the Republic of Ecuador's distinguished Foreign Minister, Luis Gallegos, and the Director of American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, Professor Eric Hershberg. Minister Gallegos has built a career unparalleled in contemporary diplomatic circles. He's served his country as ambassador to El Salvador, Australia, and the United States. He has 3 times been Ecuador's permanent representative to the UN, both in New York and in Geneva. And he is now Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs. At the United Nations, Minister Gallegos has served as a member of the Committee Against Torture, has served as chair of the UN Institute for Training and Research, and as chair of the UN Partnership for Inclusive Information and Communication Technologies, was a major force behind the creation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm proud to say that Luis Gallegos and I have been friends and tocayos for more than 25 years. And for the past 10 years, we've been American University colleagues. Minister Gallegos agreed to serve as a member of SIS's adjunct faculty in 2011, and he now serves as chair of the advisory board of American University's Institute for Public Policy and Disability. Minister Gallegos will be talking with American University Professor Eric Hershberg. Professor Herzberg is director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies and a professor in the Department of Government at American University. Professor Herzberg is a major figure in North American and Latin American studies, having served as president of the Latin American Studies Association, professor of political science and director of Latin American studies at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, and as director of the Social Science Research Council's Latin American Studies program. And Eric and I want to thank SIS alumnus and political officer in the Embassy of Ecuador, Camilo Zambrano, for helping us arrange this event.
Very well.
And now I have to say that this discussion will last about an hour with a question and answer session toward the end of the event. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at any time at the bottom of the Zoom window. Answers to questions will not be typed into the Q&A window, but the closed captions will include all responses. And we ask that no one record this session. We'll be automatically recording the webinar to the SAS YouTube channel. So with that announcement, I'm now going to turn the floor over to Professor Eric Hershberg. Eric?
Thank you very much, Dean Goodman. And thank you, Ambassador Gallegos, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to welcome you at American University. And I look forward to occasions during the coming months, I hope, when we can again meet on campus. But in this virtual setting, we can nonetheless feel that you're joining the community. And I want to thank everybody who is logged in to this session. And as Dean Goodman suggested, after some exchanges that the ambassador and I will have, we will try to take comments and questions from the audience members. So Ambassador Gallegos, I wonder if you could, just to begin, give me a sense, what is your, how would you characterize the state of Ecuador and US relations at this moment as we wind down the year 2020?
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you, Lou, for those extraordinary introductions. As a friend and as a colleague for many years, I really enjoyed meeting with you and Eric, and I have to thank Camilo for coordinating this event. I believe we are at the strongest point we have been in more than a decade and a half. President Lenin Moreno made it an objective of his government to strengthen the relationship between Ecuador and the United States, which had undergone a decrease of many years. I think that during these last almost 4 years, because the government of President Moreno will end in the month of May next year, we have had a significant advancement in a series of fields which we deem as extraordinarily important for us. I'll begin by the migratory issue because we have 1.5 million Ecuadorians in the United States who have made the United States their home, have contributed to the economy and the culture and the well-being of the United States. And as we are a small country of 17 million, I think that most Ecuadorians will have a relative, a relationship, or someone who they know who is a migrant. Therefore, the stature of the people who migrate is very well appreciated. Ecuadorians believe in the need to protect the rights of persons who are migrants, and therefore migrants to Ecuador, as we have the migratory phenomenon of the Venezuelans, have a very special status in Ecuador. We have 1.5 million in the United States and more than 1 million in Europe. So that would make us around 20 million Ecuadorians as a population. I believe we have a very strong business relationship. The United States is the largest commercial trade partner with Ecuador, both coming and going. We have the intentionality of progressing into a trade agreement. Ecuador is the only country, because of the attitudes of the governments before President Moreno's, that does not have a trade agreement in the Pacific Rim. We would like to integrate Ecuador into the alliance of the Pacific. We would like to sign agreements. We are ultimating negotiations with Mexico. We have agreements with Chile, with Peru, with Colombia, and we believe we can foster this. Our major concern in trade is, of course, the repercussions it has on the economy of the country. Ecuador is an exporting country of many tropical tropical products and of roses. We've just gotten roses integrated into the GSP. I think that when you talk about the capabilities of access to market, you also talk about the possibility of getting decent jobs to people who will be working, especially women in the Andes, who otherwise would be enticed by the drug cultivation in our northern and southern neighbors. I think that it is vital for the Ecuadorian economy to export, being a dollarized economy, and we look forward to strengthening those fields of work, both in technology and capabilities in infrastructure, which are part of the investment portfolio. I also believe that we have a very strong relationship in issues of cooperation. The United States is one of the biggest contributors to cooperation, non-refundable cooperation to Ecuador. In this year, very unique year of COVID, my personal definition of the era we are living, Eric, is that this is the first international crisis we have had that involves every country in the world, but also it's the first international crisis that involves every individual. This means that the individual, his family, his dear friends, can or will be subject to a threat of death by a virus that is uncontrollable, and that we are fighting with the same instruments that we would have 300 years ago, which is a mask distancing and cleaning our hands. But we have not had a medicine for this when we are looking forward to the vaccines. Any news of the vaccines is extraordinarily well received. But I think that these types of international crises prove a paragon of Ecuadorian foreign policy, which is multilateralism, and the way we deal with this. So we will work jointly with our partners and friends to leave this era behind. We believe that if we don't, no one is going to escape this unless all of us escape. The fourth dimension, which I'd like to talk to you about in the relationship with the United States, is this people-to-people diplomacy. I've been ambassador to the United States, as Lou said, for 5.5 years. I was a witness to this extraordinary phenomenon of those types of ties beyond the governmental ties or the parliamentary ties or those of interagency ties that we have amongst the two countries, but that of the simple people, the towns, the cities that are linked as sister cities, those of the people to people, the church to church, those of outstanding characteristics of both societies that can be linked and can progress in that sense. My vision is that this will strengthen the possibilities independently of whatever government you have in the United States or we have in Ecuador. Those are ties that are staunch relationships because they are humanly tied together.
Thank you. With regard to COVID, of course, you know, at a moment now when the United States is experiencing its highest levels of infection since the beginning of the pandemic, I'm reminded of the situation in Ecuador back in the spring when really the pandemic hit Ecuador pretty much before anywhere else in Latin America. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that has evolved. I mean, initially Guayaquil was thrown into a terrible crisis. To what extent has Guayaquil been able to get that under control? And more generally, what has been the trajectory of the virus in Ecuador?
Well, the virus came into Ecuador through our airports. It was brought in more than from the Far East, from Europe.
Right.
The strains we have of this virus were basically from Italy and Spain.
Right.
We have large migratory populations there, and people who came for vacations in early January and February brought this new element, which we were undoubtedly unprepared to deal with, as the rest of the world was. As you said, I was ambassador in New York, so by the 13th of March, New York was closing down, and we have a major closing down of Europe at the present moment, so we're still dealing with the ups and downs of these situations. Unfortunately, because of the lack of knowledge of how to deal with this, the burial of bodies had become a very touchy subject, because we were informed by the multilateral organizations that they were contagious, and they did not have the possibility of interment, which became a national disaster. It taught us a very big lesson, which I think Guayaquil has left behind, that the only way to solve this is with individual, personal commitment to use masks and have that distancing and hygiene that you need. Ecuador has been doing this. It's been very successful. Now our major spikes are in our capital and in others, but basically because we are trying desperately to have people be disciplined enough to use these instruments in order to combat COVID. We find the same human conduct and we're trying to find the equilibrium between health and economy, because a very big segment of our population are informal workers. They work in the streets. They survive on having small businesses in the streets and in our markets. And if they don't sell, they don't eat. So it is a dramatic issue, because the Commission for Latin America, the Economic Commission for Latin America, has just stated that we will decrease in Latin America between 9 to 12% of our economy. It is a structural problem of the economy that poverty will grow, and extreme poverty will grow by leaps and bounds. The regression from the compliance with the ODAs is something that we are really concerned about. And our experts and taking their conversations and consulting with international experts believe that this will take at least 2 to 3 years to overcome this with vaccines and so on, and the economy will have been affected for more than a decade. This, if I were to categorize the issue of COVID, I would say the impact has been basically in our health systems, which have put our health systems on their knees. in all over the world, whatever money you have on this thing. And in the economic sector, which has also depleted our capabilities of trade, broken our chains of trade with other countries. And of course, since part of our products are based on not having vital population activities, we're having problems when you close down countries like France or Germany or Italy because we lose market sense in that. But the third and most important effect is the social fabric. I think that you're having a vision of what these effects on our social capabilities in the world. I mean, the violence against women and children in their domestic spheres, the incapability of being able to solve social problems by dialogue, this new formulation of extraordinary methodologies like the one we're using now of being able to talk by Zoom or by platforms that are that have changed the way we work, the change in the methodologies of work, the increased division of the digital divide, the change in our educational systems, in where countries like mine find it a big challenge to have everyone having internet. The use of smartphones has become one of the most important issues, and in Ecuador, there are more cell phones than people. So technology will be a very important part of the future digressions of our society.
Can you talk a little bit more about the digital divide, how that plays out in Ecuador? This is, of course, something that has been of great concern here in the United States as we think about the implications for education that the pandemic has had. And we at AU, we've actually did a study of the impacts of the pandemic on higher education across Latin America, and we're in the process of doing a follow-up to that now, and I expect we'll have a report coming out in December. But one of the things that has really stood out in that analysis is the importance of internet access for educational inequalities in Latin America as in the United States. And I wonder if you can say a bit about the landscape in Ecuador and perhaps things that the Ecuadorian government has tried to do to reduce that digital divide.
Eric, Lou mentioned that I chair the board of trustees of G3 ICT, which is a global compact for inclusive information and communication technology, fundamentally guided to vulnerable groups and disability. When we began this in 2006, our vision was that G3 ICT, G3, now that we're going into the G5s and so on, was a major contribution for persons with disabilities. I think the iPad, the iPhone, the importance of communication really has served the disability community, the billion people with disabilities in the world, as a prompter, much more than legal reforms in the issue of disability, because it obligated societies and countries to put forward solutions for persons who had disabilities that required access to internet. So I became more familiar with an attitude that this division should not, this digital divide should not leave people behind, because the opportunities that are presented with the use of technology, having been to Microsoft, the Redmond campus, having talked to the people in Facebook, Google, and different platforms, the issue of accessibility for people who are blind, who are hard of hearing, or others, make it important, especially for those who are aging. Since I'm in the process of aging, I do believe that the billion people who are persons with disabilities will be accompanied by a billion people who are aging, who certainly in one way or the other may be disabled. As my fathers and my elders were, we will have a disability in 2 billion people with an effect of around 5 billion people, because they are fathers, mothers, brothers of people with disabilities who tend to. That taught me an enormous lesson. That if you have the capabilities of internet, if you have the capabilities of instruments, software and hardware to make that a possibility, you have a shot at being able to work better, work decently, and learn. I was just joking with Lou before we went into the cameras that I did a study in the Library of Congress in the 70s. For that study, I had to come to Washington. I had to come to Washington to go into go into the Library of Congress, get the reference book, do the studies. I spent something like 3 weeks in Washington doing that investigation. Now, with the tick of my cell phone and my smartphone, I have an access to an extraordinary gamma of information, which the underdeveloped world had always maintained was restricted to the developing society. And I repeat the example that Ecuadorians have more cell phones than people, because I do think that there are solutions. So the Ecuadorian government, under the leadership of President Moreno, who you know is a person with a disability, is staunchly trying to give the opportunities, the hotspots, the iPhones, the pads, to people who need this. Because our educational system, because of COVID, has been affected, as has the education systems all over the world, with a digital divide that is there, and we have to be able to supersede it. But I think the world will have an enormous challenge in the education of the people who are in the process formally of education, both in your universities, in your high schools, in your elementary schools, who are have an impossibility of attending those institutions as we did, and have to do it from home learning or with their parents. The situation of a change of society, which brings the workplace to your home, to your dinner table, to not only the schooling, but the work in itself, will change aspects of the post-COVID world, which will make it a dimension in which the returning to the pre-COVID world may be an impossibility.
Yes, but I mean, presumably we're seeing, as a result of the pandemic and efforts to respond to it, using these new technologies, taking advantage of connectivity, presumably that is shedding light on the key bottlenecks in Ecuador, right?
Yes, it is. We have programs, we have apps that fundamentally, even you can locate people who have COVID near you. I'm very familiar with some of the cases in other countries like Korea, who have the use of technology to extremes, where you can know, and the alert of the block you live in or the neighborhood you live in will tell you who has had this recently, who has an alert. I think this type of situation will become more familiar to us as we move forward. And will be to the benefit of us, because knowledge is whatever from these apparatus will help us be more universal, will help us be more skilled in confronting these challenges, which we are meeting now in the pandemic, but we will meet them because of climate change. I believe that this epidemic, this pandemia, is a result of climate change. Cities, encroachments into natural spaces of new species have brought in a series of these issues. This is not the first pandemic. This is not, COVID-19 is not the first SARS we're dealing with. And we've been dealing with influenza for 20 years. We still have a vaccine in influenza that is only 60% covering this. And I, as a person older than 65, get my influenza shots every year, and every time I go, there's a new strain, so the vaccine is different. So we have to look at this as this is the future. We will have to deal with climate change. We will have to deal with raising temperatures, which will make diseases like this more frequent, and we must meet them with the technologies and the capabilities that we have in order to confront this terrible scourge.
I want to return to climate change and its implications for Ecuador in a moment, but just on vaccines, I mean, this week we saw the extraordinary, very preliminary results of some of the vaccine trials, where it appears that there may be as high as 90% effectiveness rate, which really exceeds expectations and is a rare bit of positive news for 2020. But one of the questions becomes, once there are vaccines, how they're going to be made available to peoples around the world. What is your sense from Ecuador as to how the international community can be part of the solution to ensuring that vaccines, once they become available, are available to Ecuadorians?
Well, as you know, I was ambassador to the United Nations in New York when this hit us. My conversations with the Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez and his team were that we needed universal access to vaccines in a sense of humanitarian relief more than a business model. We have around 130 to 140 initiatives for developing vaccines, both by laboratories, academia, universities, a whole range of government institutions in many cases. I believe that the vaccines have to be at a price where the underdeveloped world can have an opportunity of buying or financing the buying. We have in Ecuador a number of initiatives that we have been talking. Pfizer is one of them. AstraZeneca, Oxford is another one. We've been talking with the Argentinians who under CELAC are going to produce this vaccine with AstraZeneca and Oxford, and we're going to have 250 million vaccines for Latin America that are going to be refilled or filled in Mexico. That presents a challenge because you need to have them under a certain degree of cold, which is a cold chain, which is very difficult to contain, especially in countries that have jungles or tropics or so. But I'm very enthusiastic because we also signed the COVAX initiative by the World Health Organization, and we have a number of these initiatives that we are looking to buy the 34 million doses we need, 2 doses a person. My understanding is that the AstraZeneca Oxford, because of the Slim Foundation and other contributors, will only cost $2 to $4 an injection. Now, if that is the case, we are extremely looking forward to how the industry develops this and distributes it into our countries, into Africa, into the subcontinent, into where we have the bottlenecks of extreme poverty and poverty. How do we get this into our rural areas and into our cities? And how do we actually do this? Will it last for a year? Will it be like the influenza vaccine? Do you need one like the typhoid vaccine or the smallpox? What do you need to have this? Will this be a recurring factor? Will it mutate? It's certainly mutating, as I understand. The sable issue in Denmark is one of the cases where I am particularly concerned, because if this disease, this viral disease, can decimate the sable industry in Denmark, therefore it can affect other types of animal species which might be more domesticated and so on. I would hate to do that generalized in domestic animals as we have them in farming and so on. This brings me to a center point of what the challenge means. If we don't meet this challenge as a multilateral international effort, we will not get over this. If we meet it individually because we think our territorial sovereignty ends at our borders, this will not happen. We have seen what happens to tourism and airlines and airports. In order to return to certain semblance of tourism, we need to have immunity for all the travelers going and coming, and especially the societies in which they're going into and which they're coming. Mm-hmm. So in my case, coming here, I had a test in Ecuador before I boarded the airline. The test lasts for 8 days. I go back, but the minute I go back, I have to have another test because of the expansion of this issue. Up to now, because of the meetings of the cabinets and everything else in Ecuador, I've had something like 8 or 9 tests. But these are tests. They're not the solution.
Right.
See if you caught it in one of your adventurous flights to deal with international needs of my country. I think that this is in the essence a change of our societal structures, a new contract for the world, a new concept of a society integrated into one another where solidarity is the basis. And I feel that we are not getting there. We still have these geopolitical infights which mesh into a global solution. The Security Council took 3 months to have a resolution on COVID because of the dalliances of geopolitics brought in by historical reasons. That's unacceptable. I think the UN has to be able to forcefully look into these issues and collaborate between all of us to get us out of this. Because if we don't get out of this jointly, internationally, with our efforts, we won't get out of it individually.
That's certainly the case also with an issue that you raised earlier in the conversation, which is climate change. And I wonder if you can say a bit about how Ecuador is approaching international compacts around climate, reduced carbon emissions and climate adaptation.
Well, we have signed the Paris Accord. We've signed, and we've negotiated the COPs in every dimension. We are a multi-diversified country in climate, as you know, and you probably have been to Quito. Certainly, Lou has been there. In 200 kilometers around the capital of Quito, you have every range of weather in the country, from glacial Arctic and our mountaintops to absolute tropic. That brings a variety of multi-diversity, an extraordinary ambience of differences from fauna and flora of every type. But we also have the Galapagos Islands. So Ecuador is an example of what changes in climate can actually do. Our snow-capped mountains are depleting. Our water resources are diminishing. We have problems because of excess rain or lack of rain. We have aggravated storms, aggravated phenomenon, as you have in the United States and in the rest of the world. ETA is one of the proofs. I was surprised by this hurricane that hit Central America and reversed itself to Cuba. From my understanding, this is the first time a hurricane has not come from the south of Cuba, but from another side, which demonstrates that the intervention of man for whatever it's done in the planet has to be more conscious, has to be more resilient, and we will meet these phenomena, which are graver every day, only with our capabilities as human beings and the solidarity of others. I believe that the deaths caused by your fires in California or by the droughts in other parts of the world are phenomenon that we will have to study adequately in order to solve. Climate change is here. If we do not control the emission, if we do not control what we are doing in this sense, if we do not decrease the increase of heat, we will be in for a very bad ride, and not only us, but our children and our grandchildren. My preoccupation is that the studies say that we will not be able to cultivate coffee or cocoa in 2050 because of the heat in Ecuador. What does that mean for fisheries? What does that mean for the depletion of our food sources and the capability of feeding people? That is a major concern. People are rationalizing that it's not, I'm not responsible. The government's responsible. I don't really care about my air conditioning or whatever. This is a very big error, because I think that we will get to the point where The saturation of the planet will demonstrate that we are destroying the basic components of having sustainable food and nourishment and life in our continents.
So I want to be able to address some of the questions that people in the audience have put forth and that very much build on these topics. My colleague Christian Maisch noted that there's been considerable coverage in recent weeks of overfishing on the Pacific coast of South America. And he's wondering what kinds of cooperative measures are being undertaken by countries in the region and perhaps more generally at the international level to try to manage fishery resources that are relevant to Ecuador and to the Pacific coast of South America.
I was named foreign minister on the 9th of July. President Moreno asked me to accompany him in this last stretch of the government. And I traveled from New York to Ecuador in the midst of the presence of an international fleet, the majority of whose boats were Chinese, but that had other flags, including North American. And that fleet fishes giant squid with the authority, with the permits that the authority of fishing of the Pacific normally gives. There are two entities in the Pacific called the OROC by the name, which authorize the fishing of these types of. One is the SIAT, which is the tuna, the tuna authority, and the other one is this type of different parts of the Pacific, the South Pacific. So what I did and what Ecuador did in its diplomacy is join the Commission of the South Pacific, the Eastern South Pacific, which we have in there with Peru, with Chile, with Colombia, and as an observer Panama, and we met and we decided to create a working group which would manage illegal fishing, non-regulated fishing. We went to the international organizations jointly. We just signed a couple of weeks ago a declaration with the foreign ministers of Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. I say it by geographical order more than anything else. We agreed on working together in the South Pacific organizations and others to control these types of illegal fishing. We have negotiated with the Chinese. We are sitting down at a table with the Chinese to ask for observers, to ask for inspection of those boats, because in 2017, Ecuador detained a fishing vessel by not a fishing trawler, but a vessel which carried shrimp, that carried sharks, prohibited fishing. And we confiscated the boat and we jailed this legally with all the trials and so on, and jailed the crew because this was prohibited by our law. The boat now belongs to our Navy and is one of the freighter vessels that it has. But this is only to demonstrate that we have as an obligation to the world the protection of the Galapagos Islands, which is a patrimony of humanity. I will only say that in 1978, when I was a very young diplomat in Washington, being a counselor here, I integrated the delegation of Ecuador that went to a meeting of the committee of UNESCO, the first committee meeting of the heritage subcommittee that defined which were the first patrimonies, the first heritages of humanity. And the Ecuadorian delegation got the designation for the Galapagos Islands and Quito as the first designated spots for the protection of world heritage. So we've been working at this, and I, since then and before, have been working on the protection of the Galapagos. Of course, if a massive fleet of 340 fishing trawlers and transports and this type of thing fishes off your coastal waters, even if they're not in your economic zone, it will have an effect. So we are working with all the groups involved in order to be able to protect this in the future. We are looking for the conservation and sustainable resources, and that will guarantee the production of these resources for our people and the world. So I think it is an evolution to this. We're also negotiating the BBNJ in New York on the expansion of protected zones in the high seas under the Treaty of the Seas legislation.
One of the things that you pointed out, both in regard to the fishing regulation, but also in regard to the distribution of vaccines in response to COVID, was the importance of cooperation among South American countries and among Latin American countries and more generally. And one hears a lot nowadays that regionalism in Latin America is weak, that regional cooperation is relatively weak, and that perhaps after a few years early in the 21st century, where it seemed that finally a level of regional integration and coordination might be advancing in Latin America, and now greater skepticism about whether that has in fact happened. What's your sense of the evolution in the last few years and for the next several years moving forward of intra-regional cooperation involving Latin American countries?
Well, I think it's a problem of Latin America, and it's a problem of the world. I think the multilateral system of 75 years ago, when the United Nations was created under the umbrella of the Second World War, the atrocities that had happened in the First World War with the League of Nations, and then with the Second World War. But I think the United Nations entered into a crisis when the Security Council couldn't be reformed, and where the successes of one countries who were the victors of the Second World War did not permit the expansion of the Security Council to deal not only with issues of conflict between countries, between states, but also what has proven to be in the last 30 years, the irregular conflicts, the civil strife in other countries, and these types of problems. I think that to no one's mind you can escape the possibility that this pandemic should be treated as a major security issue for all the countries. The regional integration of Latin America has always been a dream since the Pan-American Union, which created the OAS. We began to build roads and railroads to integrate our countries, to integrate our economies. I'm sufficiently old enough to say that we were more integrated with the American market than with our neighbors in Colombia and Peru, which is not the case now. We have joint cabinet meetings with the Colombians and the Peruvians. We've evolved internationally. I think the structure both of the United Nations and the OAS has to be changed, and the agencies have to change to deal with the real agendas they have to meet. When I say this, I mean it in the best positive way. I think they have to change to comply with the needs of the peoples of the Americas, independently of their ideology. I respect any ideology in the world that a country will choose for its mandates and its conduct. I think we can talk to all of them. I, as a diplomat, am a firm believer that dialogue is the basis. Yeah, I respect any country in the world, and I hope they do the same with me. I have the values of my society and the interests of my society to defend. In many cases, we will have the same interest and the same values. In some cases, we may not. But we will, at least I think we can, under a guise of civilization, be able to manage those relationships with positivity in the nature of our solutions. Unfortunately, having worked many years in human rights, I've also noted that it's not an issue of a horizontal line in which you begin from A and you progress to B, C, and D and go on. In many cases, the regressions are the ones who have taught me lessons. I worked in the Balkans before the war in Yugoslavia, but I visited the tombs in Bosnia. And I believe that these regressions, unfortunately, as a humankind, are very possible. My only wish is that we live in peace for the betterment of our societies, of our grandchildren and children. We'll have a better world. Confronting these, that are the new challenges we are meeting at the end of our lives, but they will have to confront the brunt of these changes.
There's a series of questions in the Q&A having to do with Ecuador's economy and international economic relations. And they range from questions about prospects for diversifying Ecuador's economy and Ecuador's exports to questions of the distribution of its trade partners and the nature of its bilateral trade relations with the United States. I wonder if you can say something about some of the most promising areas for economic development and for export-oriented development in Ecuador, and how those might map onto its existing and future trade relationships.
Well, I think that we have a very important evolution with the Europeans. The Europeans and Ecuador signed an agreement of accession to the European market. It's a very promising 28, and then with EFTA, we have something like 50 countries in the European market, which are rich economies, which can buy products from us and organic products and our products. We have major investments in European investments in Ecuador, and I think we are progressing very nicely in the expansion of the capacities of other products, which we need to create jobs in Ecuador. If we have to be able to create economic activity that will permit populations to grow, to educate, to have health. The only way we can do that, having a small internal market, is to upgrade the scale and export. Ecuador is a very rich country, one of the richest deltas in the world. We feed over 50 million people around the world with our products. We need access to markets under competitive measures, not with limitations that are artificial and in many cases politically oriented. We have an extraordinary relationship with the United States. We sell our products to China and Asia also. So I think we can go into a new pattern of new products that will reach other markets with our capabilities. Ecuador has a very significant population of entrepreneurs, which have made a banana industry in the 50s and 60s, which has meant that Ecuador is the first producer of bananas in the world. Dimensionally, that I bring to the table because thousands of containers a week leave Guayaquil and the ports of Ecuador with bananas all over the world. But bananas, which is a fruit, is potassium. And when you have a shrimp industry, which was non-existent 30 years ago, and it becomes the first farming shrimp industry in the world, when you have a tuna fleet, which is the second tuna fleet in the world, you ask yourself a question, which is something that I would like to answer, to saying that there's a capability of business in Ecuador, of entrepreneurship and of dedication and hard work, that is a merit and admiration to the rest of the world. Amongst them, the recently, the GSP integrated roses, which I have behind me, which is a market in which women work for, and 70% of those plantations are women, and they have become extraordinary emblems of the Ecuadorian society and Ecuadorian work. So I think we have the capabilities, the persistence and the knowledge and the technology to do that. And I think we can do it in other products. I think it's a matter of putting one-to-one together, going beyond those ideological limitations that in many cases came from a notion that we could close our borders and not integrate into the world. I think the world is interdependent and we have to use the capabilities we have. to access markets, access societies, and bring those societies and those positive issues into our society.
Yes, I think one of the things that you highlight there is something that has always struck me about Ecuador and my many visits to the country, has been the ability of Ecuadorians to create comparative advantage and to move into new industries and find new export niches. And this is certainly one of the extraordinary assets that the society has. One set of questions in the Q&A box here reminds me of a discussion we're having a great deal in the United States now, which is about the racial and ethnic disparities in the impact of the pandemic, of the coronavirus. And some of the questions have to do with how is this being experienced in Ecuador with Afro-descendant and indigenous communities, and what sorts of responses have the government and the society tried to put forth in order to meet these disparities?
I think it's a very big challenge for Ecuador or any pluralistic society that has 30 to 40% of indigenous population. Most of us Ecuadorians are integrated into a mestizo culture of integration between the indigenous and the Hispanics. Most of the society in Ecuador has an Afro-Ecuadorian society that is a demonstration of our. If you look at Ecuadorian football teams, you will find that they are basically Afro-Ecuadorian descendants. We have an enormous pride in our footballers, and I think that the issue of race in the Americas is one of primary importance. We have been educated, lived, and been side to side with the indigenous communities, with others. I have extraordinary good friends in communities, and they are leaders in their own sense. Their culture is of admiration to me, and I believe that they have distinguished themselves as communities which have a vitality which is extraordinary for the Western philosophy. Those symbolisms of how they integrate into their villages and have community values is beyond what normally the Western cultures have been able to do. My preoccupation is that Ecuador is a society that confronts COVID as a society, not as partial groups. And that, I think, is also something that any country in the world will look at. Unfortunately, those who work in the streets, if they're Hispanos in the United States, like in New York, are more affected than those that can stay in their homes, because those are the service providers. Those are the ones who work in the streets, that drive the buses, that go and deliver pizza. But in the same case as Ecuador, I think that we have to make an added effort for those who are far away from the metropolis and city. It's more complicated. We have to educate our people to be resilient in their own selves, but take care of themselves. It's an individual responsibility. The governments don't have the capability of ordering you to put a mask or closing down your village. You have to be able to understand this, to be educated enough to listen to the radio stations, to the TV stations, to your internet, to know what are the opportunities we have in this. And as I said before, we don't have many. We're still combating this disease with the same instruments we had 300 years ago or 400 years ago when the epidemics came. A mask, social distancing, and washing your hands. My concern is that we don't have a medicine to solve. If we would have one, it would be extraordinary. I have friends who have died when you put them on a ventilator. I've had friends that have survived 150 days in intensive care. And I have friends that have not. So it's a matter of how you rationalize the issue of being a society that is integrated, that with its differences and with its whatever differences you have of gender, societal origin, you have to work together to solve this problem in Ecuador, and Ecuador with other countries to solve it as an international community. This is not an isolation where you can pinpoint a place and say, this minority was excluded. All of us are in the same boat here.
No, I think this is so right. And of course, everything you say about Ecuador, we could say about the United States as well, right? These are the challenges that are challenges facing humanity and that are only going to be confronted successfully if we do them in a cooperative fashion. Just before we close, there are a number of questions about the bilateral agenda, the diplomatic agenda with US and Ecuador. And I guess the one that I would highlight, because there's so many that we could ask you to discuss, what are some issues that haven't made it onto the agenda that you think from the perspective of Ecuador would be important to put on the table for a new administration in Washington? What things haven't been discussed that Ecuador really needs to have part of the dialogue with the United States?
One of my obligations as foreign minister is to put everything on the table. And so I will tell you that we have a very long list of talking points with the Americans, a very long list which begins with security and cocaine production in our neighbors and the market in the north, both in the United States and Europe, and the double task we have of capturing practically a ton of cocaine every 2 days. This is getting out of hand. The effect it has in our society, not only of use of drugs, but the effect it has in the violence in our society has to be curtailed in some way. Or you put a lid on the top of the bottle, or you put it on the bottom, or you get another solution to this. But you have to reduce the consumption of narcotics in the developed world. The cocaine that you are consuming is 400 tons in the United States and 350 tons in Europe. And the rest is around 1,000 tons that come out of this place. So when you look at this, you look at a security issue, and Ecuador feels that there has to be a major employment of resources in order to tackle this endeavor, be them splinter groups from the ex-guerrillas, being them narco-traffickers or all. The major concern that we have pinpointed is that we are doing our jobs, you do yours. We need access to market in order to curtail that capability. We had an ATPDA system of preferences which was geared to eliminating the production of products, giving access to these products to the American market, so we would have jobs for these people not to integrate the drug cultivation north of our border. We need that vision again. We need a vision that we have to comply with necessities that are our problem, but they are your problem and the problem of the world. So we have to jointly do this by land, sea, and air with technologies that are advanced. We have a submarine with technologies that were built by the mafias. We have submersibles that use this. While you have a market, you'll find ways of getting them. I think that we have to look into the relationship with the United States as a mutually important relationship where we have neutrality of interest. It's based on respect. It's based on our laws and your laws. It's based on the possibilities that we work together in conjunction to solve those problems. And I firmly believe that we have a very intense dialogue with the United States, and we will continue to do, independently of what government comes into Ecuador. Because those 1.5 million people will continue to be in the United States. We will also have a number of people, not only in the United States, but we will also have the capabilities of production to increase our trade with the United States, and we will always have a people-to-people diplomacy, independently of what government comes into the United States or into Ecuador. So we have our paths. Jointly, we will walk side by side and look at the problems that confront us from front and behind.
And I think it's so important the way you phrase this, that These are problems that are that affect everyone in the hemisphere, but at the same time that the articulation of what the problems are and how they should be approached has to be cooperative. It has to involve the voice of Latin Americans as well as North Americans. And that an agenda for cooperation is much more likely to thrive if it's mutually constituted. And I think that certainly is going to be one of the challenges that we have moving forward. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure seeing you again. There's a number of other questions that I haven't been able to get to, but our time is winding down. I want to reiterate that American University is always happy to host you, and we look forward sometime beginning around mid-year, I'm hoping, that we can do that again in the building of the School of International Service. But for now, we take advantage of the opportunities that technology is providing for inclusion and participation, and really very happy to have been able to talk with you over this past hour. I want to thank everybody for attending this conversation as well, and for your comments and questions.